Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. We have reached part 10 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Mr. Bedford and Mr. Cavor have escaped for the moment from their Selenite captors and reached the surface of the moon. But now they need to find their spaceship, the Sphere, before the deadly cold of night draws in. They have split up so as to cover more ground, but things are not looking good. It's time to pull up a chair, relax, and enjoy part 10 of The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. 19. Mr. Bedford Alone. In a little while, it seemed to me as though I had always been alone on the moon. I hunted for a time with a certain intentness, but the heat was still very great, and the thinness of the air felt like a hoop about one's chest. I came presently into a hollow basin bristling with tall, brown, dry fronds about its edge, and I sat down under these to rest and cool. I intended to rest for only a little while. I put down my clubs beside me and sat resting my chin in my hands. I saw with a sort of colourless interest that the rocks of the basin, where here and there the crackling dry lichens had shrunk away to show them, were all veined and splattered with gold, and here and there bosses of rounded and wrinkled gold projected from among the litter. What did that matter now? A sort of languor had possession of my limbs and mind. I did not believe for a moment that we should ever find the Sphere in that vast desiccated wilderness. I seemed to lack a motive for effort until the Selenites should come. Then I supposed I should exert myself, obeying that unreasonable imperative that urges a man before all things to preserve and defend his life, albeit he may preserve it only to die more painfully in a little while. Why had we come to the moon? The thing presented itself to me as a perplexing problem. What is this spirit in man that urges him forever to depart from happiness and security, to toil, to place himself in danger, to risk even a reasonable certainty of death? It dawned upon me there in the moon as a thing I ought to always have known, that man is not made simply to go about being safe and comfortable and well-fed and amused. Almost any man, if you put the thing to him, not in words but in the shape of opportunities, will show that he knows as much. Against his interest, against his happiness, he is constantly being driven to do unreasonable things. Some force, not himself, impels him, and go he must. But why? Why? Sitting there in the midst of that useless moon gold, amidst the things of another world, I took count of all my life. Assuming I was to die a castaway upon the moon, I failed altogether to see what purpose I had served. I got no light on that point, but at any rate it was clearer to me than it had ever been in my life before that I was not serving my own purpose, that all my life I had in truth never served the purposes of my private life. Whose purposes, what purposes was I serving? I ceased to speculate on why we had come to the moon and took a wider sweep. Why had I come to the earth? Why had I a private life at all? I'd lost myself at last in bottomless speculations. My thoughts became vague and cloudy, no longer leading in definite directions. I had not felt heavy or weary. I cannot imagine one doing so upon the moon, but I suppose I was greatly fatigued. At any rate, I slept. Slumbering there rested me greatly, I think, and the sun was setting and the violence of the heat abating through all the time I slumbered. When at last I was roused from my slumbers by a remote clamour, I felt active and capable again. I rubbed my eyes and stretched my arms. I rose to my feet. I was a little stiff, and at once prepared to resume my search. I shouldered my golden clubs, one on each shoulder, and went out of the ravine of the gold-veined rocks. The sun was certainly lower, much lower than it had been. The air was very much cooler. I perceived I must have slept some time. It seemed to me that a faint touch of misty blueness hung about the western cliff. I leapt to a little boss of rock and surveyed the crater. I could see no signs of the mooncalves or Selenites, nor could I see Cavor, but I could see my handkerchief far off, spread out on its thicket of thorns. I looked about me and then leapt forward to the next convenient viewpoint. I beat my way round in a semicircle and came back again in a still remoter crescent. It was very fatiguing and hopeless. The air was really very much cooler, and it seemed to me that the shadow under the westward cliff was growing broad. Ever and again I stopped and reconnoitred, but there was no sign of Cavor, no sign of the Selenites, and it seemed to me the mooncalves must have been driven into the interior again. I could see none of them. I became more and more desirous of seeing Cavor. The winged outline of the sun had sunk now until it was scarcely the distance of its diameter from the rim of the sky. I was oppressed by the idea that the Selenites would presently close their lids and valves and shut us out under the inexorable onrush of the lunar night. It seemed to me high time that he abandoned his search and that we took counsel together. I felt how urgent it was that we should decide soon upon our course. We had failed to find the sphere, we no longer had time to seek it, and once these valves were closed with us outside, we were lost men. The great night of space would descend upon us, that blackness of the void which is the only absolute death. All my being shrank from that approach. We must get to the moon again, though we were slain in doing it. I was haunted by a vision of our freezing to death, of our hammering with our last strength on the valve of the great pit. I took no thought any more of the sphere. I thought only of finding Cavor again. I was half inclined to go back to the moon without him, rather than seek him until it was too late. I was already halfway back towards our handkerchief, when suddenly I saw the sphere. I did not find it so much as it found me. It was lying much further to the westward than I had gone, and the sloping rays of the sinking sun reflected from its glass had suddenly proclaimed its presence in a dazzling beam. For an instant I thought this was some new device of the Selenites against us, and then I understood. I threw up my arms, shouted a ghostly shout, and set off in vast leaps towards it. I missed one of my leaps and dropped into a deep ravine and twisted my ankle, and after that I stumbled at almost every leap. I was in a state of hysterical agitation, trembling violently and quite breathless long before I got to it. 3 times at least I had to stop with my hands resting on my side, and in spite of the thin dryness of the air, the perspiration was wet upon my face. I thought of nothing but the sphere until I reached it. I forgot even my trouble of Cavor's whereabouts. My last leap flung me with my hands hard against its glass. Then I lay against it panting, and tried vainly to shout, "Cavor, here is the sphere!" When I had recovered a little, I peered through the thick glass, and the things inside seemed tumbled. I stooped to peer closer. Then I attempted to get in. I had to hoist it over a little to get my head through the manhole. The screw stopper was inside, and I could see now that nothing had been touched, nothing had suffered. It lay there as we had left it when we had dropped out amidst the snow. For a time I was wholly occupied in making and remaking this inventory. I found I was trembling violently. It was good to see that familiar dark interior again. I cannot tell you how good. Presently I crept inside and sat down amongst the things. I looked through the glass at the moon world and shivered. I placed my gold clubs upon the table and sought out and took a little food, not so much because I wanted it, but because it was there. Then it occurred to me that it was time to go out and signal for Cavor, but I did not go out and signal for Cavor forthwith. Something held me to the sphere. After all, everything was coming right. There would still be time for us to get more of the magic stone that gives one mastery over men, and there, close handy, was gold for the picking up, and the sphere would travel as well half full of gold as though it were empty. We could go back now, masters of ourselves and our world, and then... I roused myself at last, and with an effort got myself out of the sphere. I shivered as I emerged, for the evening air was growing very cold. I stood in the hollow, staring about me. I scrutinised the bushes round me very carefully before I leapt to the rocky shelf hard by, and took once more what had been my first leap on the moon. But now I made it with no effort whatever. The growth and decay of the vegetation had gone on apace, and the whole aspect of the rocks had changed, but still it was possible to make out the slope on which the seeds had germinated, and the rocky mass from which we had taken our first view of the crater. But the spiky shrub on the slope stood brown and sere now, and 30 feet high, and cast long shadows that stretched out of sight, and the little seeds that clustered in its upper branches were brown and ripe. Its work was done, and it was brittle and ready to fall and crumple under the freezing air so soon as the nightfall came, and the huge cacti that had swollen as we watched them had long since burst and scattered their spores to the four quarters of the moon. Amazing little corner in the universe, the landing place of men. Some day, thought I will have an inscription standing there, right in the midst of that hollow. It came to me, if only this teeming world within knew of the full import of the moment, how furious its tumult would become. But as yet it could scarcely be dreaming of the significance of our coming. For if it did, the crater would surely be an uproar of pursuit, instead of as still as death. I looked about for some place from which I might signal Cavor, and saw that same patch of rock to which he had leapt from my present standpoint, still bare and barren in the sun, and for a moment I hesitated at going so far from the sphere. Then, with a pang of shame at that hesitation, I leapt. From this vantage point, I surveyed the crater again. Far away at the top of the enormous shadow I cast was the little white handkerchief fluttering on the bushes. It was very little and very far, and Cavor was not in sight. It seemed to me that by this time he ought to be looking for me. That was the agreement, but he was nowhere to be seen. I stood watching and waiting, hands shading my eyes, expecting every moment to distinguish him. Very probably I stood there for quite a long time. I tried to shout and was reminded of the thinness of the air. I made an undecided step back towards the sphere, but a lurking dread of the Selenites made me hesitate to signal my whereabouts by hoisting one of our sleeping blankets onto the adjacent scrub. I searched the crater again. It had an effect of emptiness that chilled me. And it was still. Any sound from the Selenites in the world beneath had died away. It was as still as death. Save for the faint stir of the shrub about me and the little breeze that was rising, there was no sound, nor shadow of a sound, and the breeze blew chill. Confound Cavor! I took a deep breath. I put my hands to the side of my mouth. "Cavor!" I bawled, and the sound was like some mannequin shouting far away. I looked at the handkerchief. I looked behind me at the broadening shadow of the westward cliff. I looked under my hand at the sun. It seemed to me that almost visibly it was creeping down the sky. I felt I must act instantly if I was to save Cavor. I whipped off my vest and flung it as a mark on the sere bayonets of the shrubs behind me, and then set off in a straight line towards the handkerchief. Perhaps it was a couple of miles away, a matter of a few hundred leaps and strides. I have already told how one seems to hang through these lunar leaps. In each suspense I sought Cavor, and marvelled why he should be hidden. In each leap I could feel the sun setting behind me. Each time I touched the ground I was tempted to go back. A last leap, and I was in the depression below our handkerchief. A stride, and I stood on our former vantage point within arm's reach of it. I stood up straight and scanned the world about me, between its lengthening bars of shadow. Far away, down a long declivity, was the opening of the tunnel up which we had fled, and my shadow reached towards it, stretched towards it, and touched it like a finger of the night. Not a sign of Cavor, not a sound in all the stillness. Only the stir and waving of the scrub and of the shadows increased. And suddenly and violently I shivered. I began, and realised once more the uselessness of the human voice in that thin air. Silence. The silence of death. Then it was my eye caught something, a little thing, lying perhaps 50 yards away down the slope, amidst a litter of bent and broken branches. What was it? I knew, and yet for some reason I would not know. I went nearer to it. It was the little cricket cap Cavor had worn. I did not touch it. I stood looking at it. I saw then that the scattered branches about it had been forcibly smashed and trampled. I hesitated, stepped forward, and picked it up. I stood with Cavor's cap in my hand, staring at the trampled reeds and thorns about me. On some of them were little smears of something dark, something that I dared not touch. A dozen yards away, perhaps, the rising breeze dragged something into view, something small and vividly white. It was a little piece of paper, crumpled tightly, as though it had been clutched tightly. I picked it up, and on it were smears of red. My eye caught faint pencil marks. I smoothed it out and saw uneven and broken writing, ending at last in a crooked streak upon the paper. I set myself to decipher this. "I have been injured about the knee. I think my kneecap is hurt, and I cannot run or crawl," it began, pretty distinctly written. Then, less legibly, "They have been chasing me for some time, and it is only a question of—" The word time seems to have been written here and erased in favour of something illegible. "Before they get me, they are beating all about me." Then the writing became convulsive. "I can hear them," I guess the tracing meant, and then it was quite unreadable for a space. Then came a little string of words that were quite distinct. A different sort of Selenite altogether, who appears to be directing the writing became a mere hasty confusion again. "They have larger brain cases, much larger, and slenderer bodies, and very short legs. They make gentle noises, and move with organised deliberation. And though I am wounded and helpless here, their appearance still gives me hope." That was like Cavor. "They have not shot at me or attempted injury. I intend—" Then came the sudden streak of the pencil across the paper, and on the back and edges, blood. And as I stood there, stupid and perplexed with this dumbfounding relic in my hand, something very soft and light and chill touched my hand for a moment and ceased to be. And then a thing, a little white speck, drifted athwart a shadow. It was a tiny snowflake, the first snowflake, the herald of the night. I looked up with a start, and the sky had darkened almost to blackness and was thick with a gathering multitude of coldly watchful stars. I looked eastward, and the light of that shrivelled world was touched with sombre bronze, westward, and the sun, robbed now by a thickening white mist of half its heat and splendour, was touching the crater rim, was sinking out of sight, and all the shrubs and jagged and tumbled rocks stood out against it in a bristling disorder of black shapes. Into the great lake of darkness westward, a vast wreath of mist was sinking. A cold wind set all the crater shivering. Suddenly, for a moment, I was in a puff of falling snow, and all the world about me grey and dim, and then it was I heard, not loud and penetrating as at first, but faint and dim, like a dying voice, that tolling, that same tolling that had welcomed the coming of the day. Boom, boom, boom. It echoed about the crater. It seemed to throb with the throbbing of the greater stars. The blood-red crescent of the sun's disk sank as it tolled out. Boom, boom, boom. What had happened to Cavor? All through that tolling I stood there stupidly, and at last the tolling ceased. And suddenly the open mouth of the tunnel down below there shut like an eye and vanished out of sight. Then, indeed, was I alone. Over me, around me, closing in on me, embracing me ever nearer, was the eternal, that which was before the beginning, and that which triumphs over the end, that enormous void in which all light and life and being is but the thin and vanishing splendour of a falling star, the cold, the stillness, the silence, the infinite and final night of space. The sense of solitude and desolation became the sense of an overwhelming presence that stooped towards me, that almost touched me. "No," I cried. "No, not yet, not yet. Wait, wait, oh, wait." My voice went up to a shriek. I flung the crumpled paper from me, scrambled back to the crest to take my bearings, and then, with all the will that was in me, leapt out towards the mark I had left, dim and distant now in the very margin of the shadow. Leap, 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 and each leap was 7 ages. Before me the pale serpent-girdled section of the sun sank, and the advancing shadow swept to seize the sphere before I could reach it. I was 2 miles away, 100 leaps or more, and the air about me was thinning out as it thins under an air pump, and the cold was gripping at my joints. But had I died, I should have died leaping. Once, and then again, my foot slipped on the gathering snow as I leapt and shortened my leap. Once I fell short into bushes that crashed and smashed into dusty chips and nothingness. and once I stumbled as I dropped and rolled head over heels into a gully and rose bruised and bleeding and confused as to my direction. But such incidents were as nothing to the intervals, those awful pauses when one drifted through the air towards that pouring tide of night. My breathing made a piping noise, and it was as though knives were whirling in my lungs. My heart seemed to beat against the top of my brain. Shall I reach it? Oh, heaven, shall I reach it? My whole being became anguish. "Lie down!" screamed my pain and despair. "Lie down!" The nearer I struggled, the more awfully remote it seemed. I was numb. I stumbled. I bruised and cut myself and did not bleed. It was in sight. I fell on all fours and my lungs whooped. I crawled. The frost gathered on my lips. Icicles hung from my moustache. I was white with the freezing atmosphere. I was a dozen yards from it. My eyes had become dim. "Lie down!" screamed despair. "Lie down!" I touched it and halted. "Too late!" screamed despair. "Too late! Lie down!" I fought stiffly with it. I was on the manhole lip, a stupefied, half-dead being. The snow was all about me. I pulled myself in. There lurked within a little warmer air. The snowflakes, the air flakes danced in about me as I tried with chilling hands to thrust the valve in and spun it tight and hard. I sobbed. "I will," I chattered in my teeth, and then, with fingers that quivered and felt brittle, I turned to the shutter studs. As I fumbled with the switches, for I had never controlled them before, I could see dimly through the steaming glass the blazing red streamers of the sinking sun, dancing and flickering through the snowstorm, and the black forms of the scrub thickening and bending and breaking beneath the accumulating snow. Thicker whirled the snow, and thicker, black against the night. What if even now the switches overcame me? And then something clicked under my hands, and in an instant that last vision of the moon world was hidden from my eyes. I was in the silence and darkness of the interplanetary sphere. 20. Mr. Bedford in infinite space. It was almost as though I had been killed. Indeed, I could imagine a man suddenly and violently killed would feel very much as I did. One moment a passion of agonizing existence and fear, the next darkness and stillness, neither light nor life nor sun, moon nor stars, the blank infinite. Although the thing was done by my own hand, although I had already tasted this very effect in Cavor's company, I felt astonished, dumbfounded and overwhelmed. I seemed to be borne upward into an enormous darkness. My fingers floated off the studs. I hung as if I were annihilated, and at last, very softly and gently, I came against the bale and the golden chain and the crowbars that had drifted to the middle of the sphere. I do not know how long that drifting took. In the sphere, of course, even more than on the moon, one's earthly time sense was ineffectual. At the touch of the bale, it was as if I had wakened from some dreamless sleep. I immediately perceived that if I wanted to keep awake and alive, I must get a light or open a window so as to get a grip of something with my eyes, and besides, I was cold. I kicked off from the bale, therefore, clawed onto the thin cords within the glass, crawled along until I got to the manhole rim, and so got my bearings for the light and blind studs. Took a shove off, and flying once around the bale and getting a scare from something big and flimsy that was drifting loose, I got my hand on the cord quite close to the studs and reached them. I lit the little lamp, first of all, to see what it was I had collided with, and discovered that old copy of Lloyd's News had slipped its moorings and was adrift in the void. That brought me out of the infinite to my own proper dimensions again. It made me laugh and pant for a time, and suggested the idea of a little oxygen from one of the cylinders. After that, I lit the heater until I felt warm, and then I took food. Then I set to work in a very gingerly fashion upon the Cavorite blinds to see if I could guess by any means how the sphere was travelling. The first blind I opened I shut at once, and hung for a time flattened and blinded by the sunlight that had hit me. After thinking a little time, I started upon the windows at right angles to this one, and got the huge crescent moon and the little crescent earth behind it. The second time, I was amazed to find how far I was from the moon. I had reckoned that not only should I have little or none of the kick-off that the Earth's atmosphere had given us at our start, but that the tangential fly-off of the moon's spin would be at least 28 times less than the Earth's. I had expected to discover myself hanging over our crater and on the edge of the night, but that was now only a part of the outline of the white crescent that filled the sky. And Cavor? He was already infinitesimal. I tried to imagine what could have happened to him, but at that time I could think of nothing but death. I seemed to see him bent and smashed at the foot of some interminably high cascade of blue, and all about him the stupid insects stared. Under the inspiring touch of the drifting newspaper, I became practical again for a while. It was clear to me that what I had to do was get back to Earth, but as far as I could see, I was drifting away from it. Whatever had happened to Cavor, even if he was still alive, which seemed to me incredible after that blood-stained scrap, I was powerless to help him. There he was, living or dead, behind the mantle of that rayless night, and there he must remain, at least until I could summon our fellow men to his assistance. Should I do that? Something of the sort I had in my mind, to come back to Earth if it were possible, and then, as mature a consideration might determine, either to show and explain the sphere to a few discreet persons and act with them, or else to keep my secret, sell my gold, obtain weapons, provisions, and an assistant, and return with those advantages to deal on equal terms with the flimsy people of the moon, to rescue Cavor, if that were still possible, and at any rate to procure a sufficient supply of gold to place my subsequent proceedings on a firmer basis. But that was hoping far. I had to get back first. I set myself to decide just exactly how the return to Earth could be contrived. As I struggled with that problem, I ceased to worry about what I should do when I got there. At last, my only care was to get back. I puzzled out at last that my best chance would be to drop back towards the moon as near as I dared in order to gather velocity, and then to shut my windows and fly behind it, and when I was past, to open my earthward windows and so get off at a good pace homeward. But whether I should ever reach the Earth by that device, or whether I might not simply find myself spinning about it in some hyperbolic or parabolic curve or other, I could not tell. Later, I had a happy inspiration, and by opening certain windows to the moon, which had appeared in the sky in front of the Earth, I turned my course aside so as to head off the Earth, which it had become evident to me I must pass behind without some such expedient. I did a very great deal of complicated thinking over these problems, for I am no mathematician, and in the end I am certain it was much more my good luck than my reasoning that enabled me to hit the Earth. Had I known then, as I know now, the mathematical chances there were against me, I doubt if I should have troubled even to touch the studs to make any attempt. And having puzzled out what I considered to be the thing to do, I opened all my moonward windows and squatted down. The effort lifted me for a time some feet or so into the air, and I hung there in the oddest way, and waited for the crescent to get bigger and bigger until I was near enough for safety. Then I would shut the windows, fly past the moon with the velocity I'd got from it, if I did not smash upon it, and so go on towards the Earth. And that is what I did. At last I felt my moonward start was sufficient. I shut out the sight of the moon from my eyes, and in a state of mind that was, I now recall, incredibly free from anxiety or any distressful quality, I sat down to begin a vigil in that little speck of matter in infinite space that would last until I should strike the Earth. The heater had made the sphere tolerably warm, the air had been refreshed by the oxygen, and except for that faint congestion of the head that was always with me while I was away from Earth, I felt entire physical comfort. I had extinguished the light again, lest it should fail me in the end. I was in darkness, save for the earth-shine and the glitter of the stars below me. Everything was so absolutely silent and still that I might indeed have been the only one in the universe, and yet, strangely enough, I had no more feeling of loneliness or fear then than if I had been lying in bed on Earth. Now this seems all the stranger to me, since during my last hours in that crater of the moon the sense of my utter loneliness had been an agony. Incredible as it will seem, this interval of time that I spent in space has no sort of proportion to any other interval of time in my life. Sometimes it seemed as though I sat through immeasurable eternities like some god upon a lotus leaf, and again as though there was a momentary pause as I leapt from moon to earth. In truth, It was altogether some weeks of earthly time, but I had done with care and anxiety, hunger or fear for that space. I floated, thinking with a strange breadth and freedom of all we had undergone, and of all my life and motives, and the secret issues of my being. I seemed to myself to have grown greater and greater, to have lost all sense of movement, to be floating amidst the stars, and always the sense of earth's littleness and the infinite littleness of my life upon it was implicit in my thoughts. I can't profess to explain the things that happened in my mind. No doubt they could all be traced directly or indirectly to the curious physical conditions under which I was living. I set them down here just for what they are worth and without any comment. The most prominent quality of it was a pervading doubt of my own identity. I became, if I may so express it, dissociate from Bedford. I looked down on Bedford as a trivial, incidental thing with which I chanced to be connected. I saw Bedford in many relations, as an ass or as a poor beast, where I had hitherto been inclined to regard him with a quiet pride as a very spirited or rather forceful person. I saw him not only as an ass, but as the son of many generations of asses. I reviewed his school days and his early manhood and his first encounter with love, very much as one might review the proceedings of an ant in the sand. Something of that period of lucidity, I regret, still hangs about me, and I doubt if I shall ever recover the full-bodied self-satisfaction of my early days. But at the time the thing was not in the least painful, because I had that extraordinary persuasion that, as a matter of fact, I was no more Bedford than I was anyone else, but only a mind floating in the still serenity of space. Why should I be disturbed about this Bedford's shortcomings? I was not responsible for him, or them. For a time I struggled against this really very grotesque delusion. I tried to summon the memory of vivid moments of tender or intense emotions to my assistance. I felt that if I could recall one genuine twinge of feeling, the growing severance would be stopped, but I could not do it. I saw Bedford rushing down Chancery Lane, hat on the back of his head, coat-tails flying out, en route for his public examination. I saw him dodging and bumping against and even saluting other similar little creatures in that swarming gutter of people. Me, I saw Bedford that same evening in the sitting-room of a certain lady, and his hat was on the table beside him, and it wanted brushing badly, and he was in tears. Me, I saw him with that lady in various attitudes and emotions. I never felt so detached before. I saw him hurrying off to Lymm to write a play, and accosting Cavor, and in his shirt-sleeves working at the Sphere, and walking out to Canterbury because he was afraid to come. Me? I did not believe it. I still reasoned that all this was a hallucination due to my solitude, and the fact that I had lost all weight and sense of resistance. I endeavoured to recover that sense by banging myself about the Sphere, by pinching my hands and clasping them together. Among other things, I lit the light, captured that torn copy of Lloyd's and read those convincingly realistic advertisements about the cutaway bicycle and the gentleman of private means and the lady in distress who was selling those forks and spoons. There was no doubt they existed, surely enough, and said I, "This is your world, and you are Bedford, and you are going back to live among things like that for all the rest of your life." But the doubts within me could still argue, "It is not you that is reading, it is Bedford, but you are not Bedford, you know. That's just where the mistake comes in." "Oh, confound it," I cried, "and if I am not Bedford, what am I?" But in that direction no light was forthcoming, though the strangest fancies came drifting into my brain. Queer, remote suspicions, like shadows, seemed from away. Do you know, I had a sort of idea that really I was something quite outside not only the world, but all worlds, and out of space and time, and this poor Bedford was just a peephole through which I looked at life. Bedford. However I disavowed him, there I was most certainly bound up with him, and I knew that wherever or whatever I might be, I must needs feel the stress of his desires and sympathise with all his joys and sorrows until his life should end, and with the dying of Bedford, what then? Enough of this remarkable phase of my experiences. I tell it here simply to show how one's isolation and departure from this planet touched not only the functions and feeling of every organ of the body, but indeed also the very fabric of the mind, with strange and unanticipated disturbances. All through the major portion of that vast space journey, I hung thinking of such immaterial things as these, hung dissociated and apathetic, a cloudy megalomaniac, as it were, amidst the stars and planets in the void of space. And not only the world to which I was returning, but the blue-lit caverns of the Selenites, their helmet faces, their gigantic and wonderful machines, and the face of Cavor, dragged helpless into that world, seemed infinitely minute and altogether trivial things to me, until at last I began to feel the pull of the earth upon my being, drawing me back again to the life that is real for men. And then, indeed, it grew clearer and clearer to me that I was quite certainly Bedford after all, and returning after amazing adventures to this world of ours, and with a life that I was very likely to lose in this return. I set myself to puzzle out the conditions under which I must fall to earth. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed part 10 of The First Men in the Moon. If you'd like to support The Well-Told Tale as we make these classics available for free to everyone, thank you. The best way to do that is through my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with part 11 of the story. I hope you can join me.